Hello, everybody. How are all of you doing out there on the radio waves? This is Anthony Cosenza joining you on this week's episode of the Orange and Black Insider, the podcast for Bengals fans. We thank you so much for tuning in live. We've got a handful of viewers, so thank you so much for tuning in live, and thank you so much for those of you that download the show if you're unable to join us live. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, and I'm going to get to him in just a second. For those, I've been asked a little bit about our other co-host, Connor Howe. He has accepted a position. I believe it was at a sports channel in a local sports channel doing some work there. So we're going to try and get him back when he's available. Unfortunately, this show, when we record, conflicts with that work schedule. But if you follow him on Twitter, if you read some of his material, all of that, wish him the best in his new endeavor. He still will be a part of this program. It just might be a bit more sporadic as we go forward. But we do miss Connor, and he's welcome back whenever he's able. But for those of you wondering, that's where our other co-host has been. But my other partner in crime, Scott Schulze, is here. And Scott, even though it's kind of a slow time in the NFL calendar, there's still quite a bit to talk about. Training camp stories, kind of some opinion pieces really come up this time of year when you look at blogs and news outlets, that sort of thing. Are you starting to get the fever a little bit, even though we're kind of in the dog days of summer in terms of the NFL calendar?
I guess I'm not quite there yet, like most fans. Still kind of waiting and just trying to come up with some stories that are relevant and not, fake news per se. So any sort of real news we can do and anything we can talk about on the St. Irenaeus Day is going to be good because it gets us closer to the start of camp and closer to the start of the season and closer to the start of their first playoff win and closer to the start of the first playoff victory. And so it all starts right here.
That's right. And unfortunately, the inception of this podcast coincided with their first losing season, really, in quite some time. But we're not making the connection here. We like to think that we're still good luck charms here. But as you mentioned, the Bengals are looking to get back to winning ways, and we've talked extensively about the draft and free agency and all of that stuff. I think this week we're going to go a little bit of a different direction, and training camp now is essentially just about a month away. I think it's 30 days away, 31 days away when they start training camp. So we're right there. We've talked a bunch about players and position battles and all of that good stuff, Scott, but we haven't talked too much about coaches outside of Marvin Lewis. Now, this program is available on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube. You can get our content in a lot of different ways. We're also on Cincy Jungle. I mentioned that every episode. We're on cincyjungle.com. So usually you can find our content split up on that site as well. Scott is a contributor at that site, as am I, aside from this show. And Scott, you put out an article that I thought was very well done about coaching the members of the Bengals coaching staff that are under the most pressure to perform in 2017. And you named kind of some usual suspects, Marvin Lewis obviously being one, Paul Alexander being another, Ken Zampese was one, and I believe there was another you mentioned Jacob Burney. So can you kind of recap that post and then obviously give kind of your thoughts on who do you think deserves that kind of heat the most out of the names on the Bengals coaching staff?
Sure. And I will say, I'm assuming you said it was a well-written post because I started it with Star Wars with a reference to Yoda and Luke Skywalker.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So obviously to anyone listening, if you write anything and mention Star Wars, I think Anthony's on it could say, that was pretty well written.
So what you're saying is that essentially that post was just written to me. I mean, it's kind of – it might as well have said, Dear Anthony, here is a post about –
I'll just mention Yoda, and then I'll just write a bunch of mumbo jumbo, and he'll see the Yoda, and I'll kind of skip the rest and be like, that was well done. like they say, if you put a book in a fancy cover, it looks better.
There you go. There you go.
So that being said, yeah, if you have not read it, it is on Cincy Jungle, and I think it goes out on Twitter. I think that's the only time I use Twitter is when these posts come out. So it's at Smackabees, or I don't know, whatever, some symbol Smackabees. Anyway, yeah, the post, I was looking at who are the most likely candidates who would be on the hot seat or need to step up the most this year for the Bengals to have a successful season. And as Anthony mentioned, the four main ones. And interestingly, as I wrote it, every coach I wrote, I'm like, oh, yeah, it's definitely him. And then I wrote the next guy, oh, it's definitely him. So the first one, the obvious one's Marvin Lewis. He's been there, 15 some years. He's the, kind of taken over the reins from Mike Brown, kind of the main guy in charge, very involved in the player personnel decisions, the draft, the in-game management, and you look at, yeah, they've been better since he's been there, since they were before he was there. But they've they've hit a wall, for the last decade. They can't get over the hump. They can't win the primetime games. They can't win the postseason games. They tend to have some odd situations with the challenges don't seem to make a lot of sense. The game clock management doesn't make a lot of sense. And a lot of that seems to fall on him and doesn't seem to get any better. So he's one candidate. Obviously, this guy, at some point, he needs to win that many years and not having a playoff victory. So he's clearly someone that needs to step up. Another one would be Paul Alexander. And the thing with him, he actually has had he's had some good success. Obviously, Andrew Whitworth was great. Paul Alexander's been there for over 20 years. Some people don't realize how long he's been there. So he was there in the Willie Anderson era. Steinbeck and Zeitler were good. Andre Smith wasn't too bad. Levi Jones was there for a while and had some good. So he's had some good players. Thing is, all those players are really high picks. All those tackles were top 10 picks. Those guards, Zeitler and Eric Steinbach, were both taken in the either first round or first pick of the second round. So you're looking at, the guys who he's taken really high have done pretty well. He hasn't bombed with those really, really high picks. Problem is, once you get up to the second round, he's really struggled. Almost every player he's drafted after round 2, he's just not been able to develop into a quality player. Clint Bowling's been one of the exceptions. Bodine, I think we've gone over that maybe a million times this podcast. He really hasn't gotten better than one of the worst ones in the league. At some point, something has to give there. The centers he's gone after, guys like Rod Payne, Eric Guychek, et cetera, et cetera. The guys he takes in middle rounds, late rounds have never developed into NFL starters other than a very small handful, like Stacey Andrews, Bowling, and it's in the post. I think there's maybe another. So he's someone that's definitely needs to step up this year because the team lost Zeitler, they lost Whitworth, and they're really counting on guys that he drafted. Well, I guess he was involved in the drafting of Jake Fisher and Cedric Ogbuehi, who have struggled so far in their careers. So if the offense is going to do well, the line needs to do well, and he needs to get the most out of those guys, which we haven't seen yet. So he's definitely in the hot seat because he needs to get those guys perform, and ideally he needs to get more out of Bodine at some point, who he keeps defending and is convinced he's a great center. So there's obviously a lot of pressure on him. Then you look at the offense just in general. Ken Zampese last year was a first-year offensive coordinator, and it showed very frequently with the play calling, the rhythm of the offense. There was a lot of issues when you watch games. You could tell there's something not right here. With all these offensive weapons, granted some of them were hurt, the team just wasn't moving the ball. They weren't scoring points. They had a lot of issues. They were they're in the bottom third in the league in scoring, and they just had a lot of offensive challenges. So he's someone that especially with the things that they've added, John Ross, they've added Joe Mixon. You figure hopefully Eifert's healthy for most, if not all, the year. AJ Green hopefully is healthy for all the year. Tyler Boyd's in his second year. Brought LaFell back. You should have a really good cast of offensive weapons that if you can't get the offense improved better from last year, well, he's someone that definitely needs to step it up. And then the last one, just to throw someone else in, I threw in Jacob Burney. On the defensive side, he was the defensive line coach who replaced the longtime defensive line coach. I think it was John Hayes or Jay Hayes, who left last year.
Jay.
The only thing with him is they have a very solid, Geno Atkins, one of the best defensive tackles in the league. Carlos Dunlap, one of the best defensive ends in the league. Michael Johnson's not horrible. D'Amato Pecco. Anyway, you still had a couple really good players. Their sack total dropped dramatically from 2 years ago to last year. So this year, you, in theory, have Andrew Billings coming back. You drafted Patrick Willis. You hopefully have Carl Lawson involved in the pass rush. Atkins is still there. Dunlap's still there. You're hoping to see an improvement on that pass rush. Ideally, out of one of the worst ones in the league to one of the better ones. And if you don't see that, he's someone that may need to move on. So basically the post was kind of going over that and saying, hey, these seem like the four most likely candidates who should be on the hot seat this year. Which one would you vote, for? So I'll turn it over to you, Anthony. Who of those would you pick, or would you pick someone totally different?
Well, see, this is why this show is so enthralling, Scott, because I had additional questions for you, but that's okay.
Okay.
If you want to spin it back, well, let me ask mine. I'm gonna be a jerk and a tyrant here and ask you a couple of questions, because first of all, great candidates in terms of a potential answer to this question of which coach should be under the most scrutiny or under the most pressure in 2017. Obviously, Marvin Lewis is the most obvious candidate of the group just because of his tenure and all kinds of stuff. I have two questions for you. One is, I noticed an omission of Paul Guenther on your list, and you mentioned Jacob Burney, who, in a sense, works for Paul Guenther because he's a position coach under the defensive coordinator. I think Guenther has done a pretty good job carrying the torch from Mike Zimmer. I still think I think most would agree, Mike Zimmer just in general had maybe a little bit more respect, and there was just a tiny bit more of an edge to his defensive units maybe than Guenther. But overall, I mean, the defense is still performing pretty well and did very well at the end of last season when the offense was completely sputtering. I guess my question is, even though you omitted Guenther on this list, you mentioned a lot of other talent that he's getting either getting for the first time. Vontaze Burfict isn't missing the first couple of games of the season. Andrew Billings is basically an extra draft pick who might start for them this year. Carl Lawson, they got edge players galore. I guess even though his unit has been performing well, isn't there a little bit more pressure on Guenther just because of the added talent they grabbed this year? Kevin Minter being another guy.
I just went and looked up some of the season statistics, and one of the reasons I did not put Guenther on there is I think he's done very well. I think he is someone who the national media, to a degree, and Bengals fans have probably overlooked. And one thing you mentioned, Zimmer was a personality. He was someone we've seen on Hard Knocks. People a lot of fans kind of fell in love with him as hard edge. His kind of tough guy. He's a football player coach. I mean, he is what you think of. That gruff, we're gonna kick butt, and that's just who he is. And there was, and a lot of people really liked his story where, he had the issues with, and was cancer. His wife died mid-season or something, and so there was a personal connection, and so a lot of people just really had a strong connection to him, and a lot of people wanted to see him as our next head coach, which obviously didn't happen. So I think because of that, people have kind of overlooked what Guenther has done. 2 years ago, they finished second in the NFL. They were actually first in the NFL in points allowed until the last week of the year, and then fell down to number 2, which is the best finish ever in Bengals history.
Mm-hmm.
This year being 2016, they finished 8th overall, which is one of their better finishes, and that's with an offense that was absolutely horrible and forcing the defense to be on the field all the time. So, I guess my perspective, this guy has been, done amazing things. They didn't get the sacks, but with and without help from the offense, they've still done a very good job defensively, stopping teams from scoring on them, from moving the ball. So I kind of figured Guenther, I don't think he'd be on the hot seat, so to speak, because he has done really, really well. Unlike the offense last year, unlike Marvin Lewis, he's a guy who I think, he could have a bad year and not be on the hot seat because he's just done. I mean, I don't expect him to have a bad year, but he's just done so well that I think if they were to let him go, someone would scoop him up right away.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I largely agree with you, and he's had a couple of head coaching interviews, I believe, over the past couple of seasons, or at least some interest from teams. Before I get to some additional thoughts of mine, Scott, the other question I had was now it might be slipping my mind a little bit, but I think it had something to do with, you mentioned all of these guys, and you didn't really give your thought on who. Well, you asked me, but you didn't give your thought on who yours is. Now, if you want me to go first, I can do that.
First and last.
What's that?
Yeah, I'll let you go ahead and go first.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right.
I'm just because I kind of know, but I don't know what mine is yet.
Well, I'm going to go a little off the grain here a little bit. I really like the Paul Alexander example, and I don't know if I specifically think it's because I think he's going to potentially lose his job. I just think there's a lot of pressure on him this year for the reasons you mentioned, with the young tackles, 2 new tackles, a new right guard, a center who has been up and down, and that's being generous over the past couple of years. This is a completely new offensive line, and this is a coach who has groomed a lot of good players and gotten players to Pro Bowls, but it's also a guy who has preferred players like Nate Livings over Evan Mathis, if you remember that. And every time Evan Mathis was in the game, the offensive line was just better. And Evan Mathis ended up making a ton of Pro Bowls, and Nate Livings was meh at best. I will say this about Paul Alexander. I said this, I think, on the episode that Rebecca Toback was on, and you weren't here, Scott, but I have a friend of mine who is a small college offensive coordinator, and he says he annually goes to a kind of a symposium that Paul Alexander puts on to speak to coaches, talking about coaching tactics, motivation theory, all of that kind of stuff. And he said among the college level coaching ranks and across the nation, Paul Alexander is widely viewed as one of, if not the best, offensive line coaches and one of the better NFL offensive coaches that's out there. Now, some fans may balk at that, but this is coming from a college level coach that I know who told me this basically about a month or two ago. So kind of interesting thing there. I kind of think him, obviously Zampese and Lewis are easy targets. One guy I think is actually under some pressure that may or may not be fair is Kevin Coyle, the secondary coach. And I say that because he ended up replacing Vance Joseph, who was a very effective secondary coach. Now, the Bengals secondary ended up playing better down the road last season, but they started off not so great. And if you remember, there were reports of potentially players not really gravitating to Kevin Coyle the same way as they were Vance Joseph during the season. There was a lot of animosity supposedly in that position room. We don't know the full details, but things did get worked out. But now Kevin Coyle has a hothead probably starting for him in Adam Jones, and a guy who has an off-field issue this last January. They did re-sign Drake Kirkpatrick. Now they add in, William Jackson coming back from injury. Darquez Denard, he needs to show that he can develop into a solid NFL corner. You've got Josh Shaw. So I actually think Kevin Coyle is a guy kind of behind the scenes that may be under a little bit of pressure, aside from the obvious ones of Lewis, Zampese, things like that. So that's my take, Scott. Who do you narrow it down to?
For me, it was I kind of went through all of them, and I'm even half tempted, just because it's all of them, to even go with the guy who I first mentioned in the article, which is Yoda, because he was a coach. You look what he did. He didn't want to train Luke. He couldn't defeat the Emperor. He went and fled instead of facing his failure, and then he dies in the middle of training him. But in all seriousness, I guess it's the Bengals podcast. So that being said, I'm going to go with Marvin Lewis. And I know it's the easy answer, but he's kind of the one constant. He's the one who's always been there. He's he has been able to get him to the big games, but he just can't win the big. And a lot of the big game wins it's usually not one thing. It's a whole slew of things. And he's kind of the guy, he's responsible for getting all those things coordinated. The defense tends to go to heck in the big games. Yep. The offense tends, it's like everything just falls apart. And then you still have the really bad game management, the very odd use of the little red flag, the challenge. It's just it's like the team's just not prepared, and there's this something, and it never gets any better. And so for me, it's just hard not to say, I have to start at the top. And that's the biggest thing that needs to be resolved if this team's ever going to win a playoff game.
I totally agree. And unfortunately, these primetime games, whether they're playoff games or, the big ones on Monday Night Football, Sunday Night Football, that sort of thing, many of them are not only losses, they're embarrassments. And in terms of blowouts, in terms of how the team performs, you saw the implosion at the 2015 wild card game. Now, a couple of those postseason games, Marvin Lewis hasn't had a fair shake. The Carson Palmer injury, Andy Dalton was hurt during an MVP type of season in 2015 and wasn't available in that game. But we've seen so many games where the team looks unprepared, they look nervous, they play tight, and they just do not execute, to use a cliche NFL term. And unfortunately, it's in these big moments. And I've said on probably this show, other shows, and other platforms that a team usually takes on the personality of its coach. And in these big moments, we've seen maybe the team kind of taking on the personality of Marvin Lewis in terms of being timid and maybe a little lost in these big moments and shying away from some of the better teams in terms of execution. We look at some of the comments in the YouTube chat. Greg L. actually says excited for our secondary, so he doesn't agree with me necessarily on Kevin Coyle. Now, I do want to say there are different reasons as to why coaches may or may not be on the hot seat. Obviously, it's performance. Obviously, it might be also pressure to live up to expectations, as Greg has for the secondary because of the talent there. So there's kind of just some different points of view with this. Michael Myers says, I would think the D-line coach, only because our run yards against were out of control and the sack numbers were a little down as well last year. Gotcha. There was Garrett Ford was also talking about the running game. So I don't know if that's necessarily Paul Alexander or if that's running backs coach Kyle Kasky or both, but he basically said there's no running lanes last year with the exception of playing the Browns. So kind of some comments there. We do want to keep hearing from you. So let us know in the YouTube chat. Let us know in the comment thread at Cincy Jungle. We are live in both of those. Let us know in the comments. If you record the show down the road, you can let us know what coach is under the most pressure or who might be on the hot seat this year if they do not perform as up to expectations, or like a Marvin Lewis, a Paul Alexander, guys who've been here in Cincinnati so long, and maybe it's time for a change for the sake of change and possibly to get the team finally over that hump. We'll see. We want to hear from you, though. And again, if you can't check us out live on YouTube, the YouTube chat, there's a lot of Bengals fans who come in and interact both with us and with their fellow fans. So join them there, as well as on the Cincy Jungle comment thread. Our content is on cincyjungle.com. It's on YouTube. It's on SoundCloud. It's on iTunes, so you can download it in a variety of different ways. We appreciate the support. Scott, let's kind of keep on the same wavelength here, but not talk so much about coaches. There are a number of different Bengals players who are under pressure as well this year to perform. The reasons, much like the coaching staff and the reasons we brought up with that, vary. They can range from, a player signed a recent pretty big contract extension in this offseason, last offseason, that sort of thing. They might be facing a contract year this year and have questions as to why they should receive a big contract extension. there are players who are in high-profile positions, have not played well in these big games like we just talked about. I'm curious to know some of the players, maybe a couple from you, a couple of Bengals players who are really under some big-time pressure this year as the Bengals try and get back to the postseason. And why?
Go ahead.
No, I was just saying and why, and the reasons why.
Okay, I'm going to give a couple different guys for a couple different reasons. The first one is Jeremy Hill. And you think, well, it doesn't make a lot of sense because we just drafted Mixon and we have Giovanni Bernard. And I think that's why it's more important for him to step up because he's playing for a contract somewhere, probably not with the Bengals, but he's under a lot of pressure to keep his playing time, to keep his role in the offense because you don't use a high second-round pick on it. Well, I guess it wasn't high. You don't use a second-round pick on a guy because you have no intention of playing him. So you figure the Bengals like Mixon. He can be a three-down back. He can pretty much do everything they want Hill to do except do it faster and better. So he's someone who I think is under a lot of pressure. I think he's seen that. He came in, I think the OTA is in better shape, kind of a renewed commitment or whatever. So I think he's someone for his perspective needs to step up. And if he does step up because he knows, hey, I'm playing for a contract to play somewhere next year and I want to get paid. I don't want to be a guy who gets, forgotten in the offense, gets 400 yards rushing and gets like some league minimum contract stuck on the Browns or something. If he wants to make some money and, he's someone's going to have to step it up. But as far as the success of the team, the one who I think who is under the most pressure, and he's been underrated, been a good guy, I want to say is Andy Dalton. And the reason I'm saying that is because the offensive line, because he needs to – the one thing he's always kind of struggled with is when he came in the league and for his first few years, whenever he got any sort of pressure, he would just kind of collapse and wait for the sack to get him. He's gotten a little better at that as far as, okay, I'm getting some pressure. I'm going to extend the play a little bit, maybe step up, look for a guy to throw it at right away before, the pressure hits me. He needs to take a major step forward in that area because, I think our expectations are the offensive line could potentially be really bad this year. And if it turns out to be as bad as it possibly could be, based on how Boyhe and Fisher and Bodun have played up through this point in their careers, he's going to have to become basically Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers doesn't really play behind the best offensive lines, but he is great at sensing pressure, eluding pressure, extending the play, finding the open guy, and getting the ball to them. And that's something I think is going to be very important to see Dalton do this year for the team to have success. I mean, he's very good. You give him blocking. He can read a defense. He can find the open guy. More often than not, he can get it to the open guy. Or he can heave it up to AJ Green, who's going to catch the ball in triple coverage. But if you get pressure on him every play, as soon as he gets the ball, can Dalton take that next step and be that guy who senses the pressure, reads the pressure, can elude it long enough to get to the hot receiver or someone who's going to catch the ball? And then secondly, I think he's also under pressure because you've given him a ton of weapons at this point. You used a high pick on John Ross, used a second-round pick last year on Tyler Boyd. You have an experienced veteran who's fairly decent in Brandon LaFell. You have an elite wide receiver in AJ Green. You have a great tight end when healthy in Tyler Eifert. You now have two running backs who are very good at catching the ball in Mixon and Bernard. And you've kind of said, okay, we've given you pretty much every offensive weapon that we can give a team can reasonably give you. So, I mean, we've gotten you great tight end, great receiver, running backs and catch the ball. Pretty much everything you need to succeed is right here. So I think he's going to be under pressure to show he can use all those weapons. He can get the ball to them and let them make plays. And he can do that while possibly under a lot of duress. So for that reason, I'm going to say I think Dalton, for the team's success, is going to have to step it up and overcome what could be weaknesses in front of him so he can get the ball to all these playmakers who they seem to have, at least at this point.
He'll either have to be Aaron Rodgers or he may have to be Russell Wilson, and that's a little Easter egg for our next segment coming up here in just a few minutes. I find myself having trouble disagreeing with any of those players that you mentioned, Scott. I do like that you mentioned, again, those tackles, Jake Fisher and Cedric Ogbuehi, and I think I look at them and this line really will hinge on those two guys' performance, and they have largely been disappointing, and that's being kind, especially Cedric Ogbuehi last year in his stint as a starting right tackle. It was pretty awful. Now he's moving to the left side. Hopefully things will be getting better. We see some things on social media that show that he's taking his workouts very seriously and things of that nature. So maybe that'll translate on the field. But, you mentioned, it's so funny, you mentioned Andy Dalton, and you say, hey, we've given you all of these weapons. We've given you all of these fun players to surround you with, to basically give the ball off to and let them do a lot of the work. Yet they've completely rolled the dice now on what may be more important, which are the guys that are protecting him. So that to me is, I think those two guys are two big ones to look at. I mentioned some contract situations. There's also Vontaze Burfict and Tyler Eifert. They have some things to prove in. And if they get contract extensions this summer, they will have more to prove in terms of being able to stay on the field, whether it's injuries for both of them, suspensions for Burfict. But those guys have been to Pro Bowls. They've been productive players. And, I think they have something to prove in terms of if they do not get a contract extension this summer, they'll need to prove that they can stay healthy and be productive this year in order to get that extension next offseason or during the season. But they'll also, if they do get that contract extension this summer, they'll need to prove that they are worth that type of money in terms of health and staying on the field, that sort of thing. One other guy that kind of springs to mind is Adam Jones. And again, I hate to kind of continue to make the guy this show's whipping boy, but he brings a lot of things on himself. And after his blow up in the wild card game and some other things we've seen from him and obviously his extensive legal history, he's a guy who sometimes has trouble endearing himself to fans because of his actions and some of those things. And then there's the legal issue that took place this January. So now he signed a big contract extension in the 2016 offseason to make him a pretty solid starting corner. Now he's up there, I believe he's 33, 34 years old. So he's at the very tail end of his career. He may not even see all 3 years of the extension that he signed, but he's under contract. He's probably going to start even with this most recent issue. If he doesn't come out on the field and play well, I mean, he was still pretty solid last year. He definitely wasn't great in the punt return game when given limited chances. He wasn't a Pro Bowl cornerback, but he was pretty good. He was solid as a starter, I guess. Wasn't his best season, though. If he comes out and continues to erode in terms of talent, the age shows, maybe give up a few more big plays than we're accustomed to, you may see quite a few people turn on Jones and really, fairly or unfairly, point to the offseason issue as something to criticize him about and or use it as a reason for his struggles. We'll see. I do think there is pressure on Adam Jones. Scott, you have another item you want to discuss on this topic.
Yeah, there was one thing you mentioned, and it made me think of an old MTV show from years ago called Pimp My Ride, which for some reason just reminds me of the Bengals offense this year, the way it's built. And I may be too logical. I don't know. But whenever I saw that show a few times, I had a roommate who loved watching that show. And the thing that always struck me as odd about it was they would take these crappy old cars, they would add all these bells and whistles, make them all fancy and shiny, put all this cool stuff on them. But at the end of the day, the engine, the chassis, the shocks, they were still crappy cars. They were just crappy cars with fancy, nice little fancy things on them. They were still going to fall apart in a few years. And that seems to be kind of how the Bengals are building the offense. They have all these great, bells and whistles and trinkets and, the speed receiver, this guy, that guy, all these, investment guys that catch the ball, guys that run the ball, a good quarterback, elite tight end, whatever. But yet that core foundation, that thing that all this is built on, the offensive line is, like you said, that's where they're rolling dice. That's where they've kind of let that kind of erode from under them. And it's going to be very interesting to see, is this going to be something that, one of these cars that kind of hops up and down and has the base but doesn't move and is sitting on blocks in the parking lot of Paul Brown Stadium? Or is this thing actually going to be, zipping up and down I-71 and I-75 going through Cincinnati, with all the people latching their bandwagon on saying, yeah, let's. So I don't know. I'm just very curious to see what. Sorry, it's kind of a tangent, I guess.
Yeah, I like it. I like the metaphor there. Yeah, it comes down, if you want to use another metaphor, if this team is a house of cards, or something where it's all flash and not a lot of substance. And sometimes the all flash teams, not as often, but sometimes a lot of teams with a lot of flash and a lot of weapons, with deficiencies in other areas that aren't as visible to the casual fan's eye. Sometimes teams can get past it, whether you have a great quarterback and a lot of different offensive weapons, a quarterback with a lot of deficiencies, but an outstanding defense. We've seen teams go far with glaring deficiencies, and we don't want to say yet that the offensive line is a glaring deficiency. Obviously, it's the biggest area of concern, and we haven't seen this group play get out there, start games together, and play against NFL talent. But we all know it takes time for NFL offensive line units to gel. There's a lot of new pieces on this line. Some guys playing positions that they're not used to. So there is a lot to worry about. But also, there's 2 first-round picks on there. There's 2 fourth-round picks and a second-round pick that are starting for you. So there's a lot of high investments on that offensive line, and they're guys that the coaching staff felt that they were very talented, some of which have shown it, others have not. So we'll see what happens. In the YouTube chat, I saw Greg L. say Jake Fisher plus Cedric, oh boy, he equals this season. I think that's, a little over dramatic, but it's pretty true. And I think also Greg mentioned, to your metaphor, Scott, he said, so it's a 1988 Nissan Pulsar. I have not had the pleasure of driving that vehicle, but I don't see many of those on the road anymore myself. So I'm assuming that's probably not a very good car. And hopefully the Bengals aren't falling into that category. We're gonna get to our next segment. Before we do, if you have some questions, we're going to try and get to some listener questions at the end of the show. We saw a couple that came our way in the YouTube chat. Keep sending those to us. We're going to try and get to those at the end of the show. You can tweet them at us at BengalsOBI, whether it's during the live feed or after. You can tweet them at us, or you can email your questions. We've had a few over the past couple of weeks that have come through email, theobinsider@gmail.com. You can send them there as well. Comments, questions can also be taken when you download the show on iTunes, on YouTube, on SoundCloud, and on Cincy Jungle. We scour through those, and we appreciate the feedback. Scott, we've been doing this a little bit more frequently than I would like when it comes to the Bengals, but it's time to nominate some haters of the week. And one of which I know for a fact has made this program's Hater of the Week segment before. Another, I'm not so sure, but I alluded to this in our last segment. Pro Football Focus, and I'm sorry that Connor isn't here because he has a lot of strong opinions on Pro Football Focus. They recently came out with their rankings of the NFL's offensive line units. And in their ranking of their offensive line units. The Bengals came in at number 31, second to last. And I mentioned Russell Wilson because the Seattle Seahawks were number 32 in that analysis of theirs. It's based on what we just said about the Bengals offensive line. It's really hard to get very critical about their analysis on the Bengals offensive line, but still seems like kind of a big slight, no?
Kind of yes and no. I mean, I can definitely see where they'd be coming from. I mean, your top two running backs average, barely 3.5 yards a carry. Last year, Dalton seemed to be under pressure quite a bit. And as bad as that was, you lost your two best offensive linemen. So I think it's very easy until they prove someone wrong just to kind of assume they're down near the bottom somewhere.
Yeah. This group could be a feast or famine in terms of production type of group. If somehow Boyhe and Fisher turn into serviceable to above average starters, all of a sudden this unit is probably top half of the league, if not higher. If they continue to falter, you're probably looking at it. Still, it was a little bit of hate on the Bengals, and we have to point it out by Pro Football Focus. They do put out a lot of quality material. There's quite a few things I agree with that they put out. Some stuff I don't necessarily agree with, but I respect their metrics and the way they collect their data. So check that out. Their offensive line rankings, the Bengals were number 31 of 32 teams in that recent post of theirs. Now, Scott, we come to, unfortunately, the NFL Network's Top 100. Now, I think we all agree it's a pretty entertaining series. You get to hear a lot of different things from players within the league, teammates, and you get their take on certain players that have made this list, and it's pretty interesting. However, it's completely arbitrary. Some of the players that make the list are you kind of scratch your head over others, and there are two Bengals players who were snubbed on this year's list. One of which I kind of understand, the other I kind of do not. Let's start with the one I kind of understand, and that's Andy Dalton. And the reason I kind of understand is because the touchdown numbers dipped, and I think there's also the Dalton can't win the big game stigma, whether that's fair or not. That's out there, and I think that's prevalent among NFL fans and players who play against Andy Dalton. I guess there was something that they put out that guys who barely missed the cut, and he was one of them. Do you think that Andy Dalton deserved, after even throwing over 4,000 yards last year and limiting the turnovers, do you think he should have been on this year's NFL Network Top 100 players?
I'm going to give a very ambiguous yes and no. And the reason I would say yes
Okay.
is I believe he was on it last year. I think last year he was, I forget where exactly, I think it was 50 to 70. Well, he's the same guy he was last year, maybe even a little better. He did have a lot more pressure. He did have his top offensive weapons go down. He did have a new offensive coordinator who was struggling. But if you look at how he played, like if you actually analyze him, Andy Dalton, the quarterback, his passes, his reads, his quarterback stuff, it was pretty much, comparable to what he did last year. So if he's a top 50 guy last year, he should be on the list this year. And especially if you consider he's probably no worse than guys like Alex Smith, who was on the list. And there was another quarterback, Kirk Cousins. I don't think he's any worse than those guys. He's probably in that same range, maybe slightly better. They both made the list. That being said, these lists are generally a popularity contest. The Bengals won 6 games last year. 6 games out of 16 is not very good. The quarterback is going to be the guy who gets the praise when you win, whether he deserves it or not. And he's the guy who's going to get the blame when you lose, whether he deserves it or not. So that being said, I totally understand why he's not on the list and why they dropped him to that just missed the cut. And I think once you get beyond these top 15, 20 guys, you kind of have like this very ambiguous blob of maybe 50 guys from like that 60 to 110 range, or somewhere in there. That if you told me Dalton finished 80th or 101st, I think most people say, yeah, that's about right. He's kind of in that range. So I am not too surprised. Now, if they'd gone 16-0, he won the MVP, they won the Super Bowl, and he still wasn't on the list. Then I would be very surprised because you can't get any more popular than that.
Right. Again, this is a total arbitrary thing. It's a list that the network came up with, and something to have a lot of people talk. And it is, it's worth talking about. It's something that gives fans a lot to talk about during some of these slower months of the NFL calendar. I agree with you that, I'm not saying Andy Dalton should be in the top half of this list or top 25 or anything like that, but I think he deserves some credit. And I think, you're talking about Alex Smith and Kirk Cousins. Alex Smith was 81 and Kirk Cousins was 70 on the list. I tend to think in terms of talent, Andy Dalton's right there, if not above those guys. Again, the losing, and this is what I like about this list, but what also drives me crazy about this list, there's not so much a lifetime achievement award type of stigma so much in this NFL top 100 list. It really is a bit knee-jerk in terms of season to season. So that's why you see a guy like Dak Prescott, I think he was in the top 25 or top 30, if not higher this year, and Andy Dalton's off the list, whereas Andy Dalton has far more wins, has set franchise passing records, all of that. I just hope, and not that this should really matter in terms of, these guys make a ton of money and they get a lot of fame. I just hope that these types of things, maybe they use them as chips on their shoulders this year. When as they come off of a 6-win season, maybe they kind of say we're disrespected. It's us against the world, that sort of thing. And maybe it gives them a little extra fire since, they're a little bit of a small to mid-market team and don't get the attention that some of these other guys get. And maybe they should be getting as some of the other guys on the list. The other guy I want to talk about is Vontaze Burfict. He was snubbed on this list despite being highly rated by Pro Football Focus and being a very effective defender, especially down the stretch of last season. I almost wonder, well, I don't almost wonder, I'm fairly certain that because there was another article that was recently put out that he was one of the most disliked players or dirtiest players, same type of deal, in the NFL. Are you having any doubts that has any kind of bearing on why he didn't make this list? I know he missed a couple games from suspension and everything, but still had a very productive 2016 season.
Yeah, if you're going to tell me he didn't make the list because he only played 11 games, that I can buy. Unfortunately, I think we would both agree that's not the case. That's not why he didn't make the list. When he's on the field, he is one of the best linebackers in the NFL. That defense looks totally different. The way he plays, his instincts, his speed to the ball, the way he can cover even for a bigger guy who didn't exactly, light up with the 40. He's not John Ross, but, he knows what he's doing. He does it very exceptionally. He's a big hitter, but not one of these, crazy guys that misses tackles because he's just an all-around awesome linebacker. The problem is, as you said, no one likes him. He has a very bad reputation. He does play a little dirty. If he played dirty on a winning team, I don't think anyone would care. If he was on the Steelers or Packer, a team that people tend, or Cowboys, one of these teams that generally is rated really high, that fans really like, the Patriots, people say, yeah, he's dirty, but he's a good player. You put him on a team that has, the Bengals, where they don't have the biggest media following. They're a smaller market team. They already kind of have the bad stigma of, the players because 10 years ago there were some guys getting arrested like Chris Henry. You throw in Vontaze Burfict on there, and you get a totally different media reaction. The national narrative is a little different. Because of that, I think he gets a very different take. it's very easy to dismiss him. And I think it's one of the reasons he hasn't gotten more accolades. I mean, this guy deserves many more Pro Bowls and All-Pro selections than he has. And it's basically because of his perception. It has nothing. If you look at him on the field, he is just a phenomenal player. And the defense is totally different when he is on. There's no way you can not include him for anything football related. And I'm assuming we're probably in agreement on this to some degree. I mean, there's absolutely no way you can't have him in the top. He should be like number 1 or 2 in linebackers, I would say. And definitely in the top 30 or 40, except for the fact that his name is Vontaze Burfict.
Except for the fact that his name is Vontaze Burfict and the fact that he did miss 5 games last year. You look at it, though, 101 total tackles, third best in his career behind the 2 seasons where he played 16 games, 73 solo tackles, I believe, which was tied for second best with one of the seasons he played in 16 games. 2 sacks, second best in his career. 8 passes defended, best in his career. 2 interceptions tied for best in his career. So, I mean, there's a lot of career bests after the guy, had made the Pro Bowl a couple of years ago and that sort of thing. Again, he's a guy that I believe someone in the YouTube chat, I missed who it was, had said he only had two penalties against him last year. Obviously did clean up some of his plays. That I still want to see him play with an edge. I don't want to see him go over the edge. I think everybody can agree with that. But he's a guy who's going to need to be on the field for the majority of the season, not only for the Bengals defense to be one of the best once again, but for him to be on this NFL Top 100 list next year, if that's so much matters to you. But those are our haters of the week, Pro Football Focus and the NFL Top 100. The voting powers that be in the NFL Top 100. I did see our colleague Rebecca Toback in the chat room. Hi, Rebecca. How are you? She wrote, someone posted Antonio Brown's ballot for the NFL Top 100 on Facebook. He must have posted it at some point on his own social media, and he had himself number 1, and numbers 1 through 5 were all Steelers. Okay, so that tells you a little bit of some of the mindsets of players as they make these choices. Obviously, they want to root for themselves, their teammates, to get notoriety and all of that stuff. The NFL Top 100 is what it is. You can let us know your thoughts on in the YouTube chat, on the Cincy Jungle comment thread. You can get all of our content on Cincy Jungle, YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes, and you can get in touch with the show on Twitter at BengalsOBI and via email, the obinsider@gmail.com. We did get a couple of fan questions. I'm going to get to that in just one second. You can still submit them last minute. We'll try and get to those before we get out of here. Scott, I saw one earlier, and it was about, let me see here. It was about the center situation, and it was from Garrett Ford. He wrote, other than TJ Johnson, who I believe we signed to a 2-year deal after this season, after this season, do you see us re-signing Bodine or drafting a new center? Basically, what do you see happening at center? Well, obviously that's tough to predict because we're going to need to see what Bodine does this year on the field. TJ Johnson just seems like a swing backup guy to me. Otherwise, he probably would have, and or fill-in guy for injury, which I believe he's done in limited spots in his career, but he hasn't been able to crack the starting lineup. He just doesn't seem to be NFL starting caliber, at least in the eyes of the Bengals coaching staff. Your thoughts on this question, Scott?
I think if Marvin Lewis is back one more year and therefore Paul Alexander is back one more year, I think the answer is Russell Bodine's our starting center. I think they re-sign him, bring him back. He's the answer. And then either TJ Johnson or JJ Dielman will be the backup. If they move on from Marvin Lewis, stranger things have happened. If they move on from him, I think, and they bring in a Now that's assuming they don't promote someone like Paul Alexander to be head coach. If they bring in someone from outside, kind of do a clean sweep, then I could see the team taking a very fresh approach, saying, okay, who do we have signed under contract? We have G.J. Johnson and J.J. Dealman. We'll check them out, see if there's anything there. If not, then we look at drafting a guy because because the offensive line possibly could be a big weakness. I mean, if we lose all the coaches and they do a restart, it's probably because the offensive line struggled horribly and we lost a bunch of games despite having all these great weapons. And if that happens, the offensive line will probably be a big focus come draft day next year, or draft days next year. So I think it depends on who. If Lewis is still here, I think it's Bodine. If he's gone, I'd say it's a free agent, or we might even sign a free agent. If Lewis leaves, who knows what'll happen.
Yeah, I agree with you in terms of if the coaching staff stays intact. One guy, I don't know if I don't think you mentioned him. You mentioned J.J. Dealman, Christian Westerman. I think that's a guy who might be a little interesting as well in terms of center capability. He is listed as a guard. He was a guard in college, but again, similar mold in terms of the upper body strength. A little bit he was actually known as a second or third round talent when the Bengals grabbed him in the 5th round, not this draft, but the one before. So he might be a guy they look at, especially maybe even in season, if the offensive line ends up being a total mess, including Bodine. So that's another guy who is currently on the roster that could be an option. And we have another question that's kind of related to this. I'll get to it in a second. Again, if the coaching staff ends up getting, swept out the door, I think, like you said, Scott, I think there would be a complete overhaul of the offensive line. And I believe it was Rebecca Toback once again in the YouTube chat who said if Marvin Lewis goes, she believes that the rest of or a good majority of some of the coaching names we've already mentioned on the program will go, and I tend to agree with her on that. I think, if Marvin Lewis isn't here, I think then there's going to be a complete different change and a completely different look of the coaching staff next season. But let's hope the Bengals are successful, and that's not going to be a talking point after 2017. Kind of related to this, Michael Myers, another regular of the program. Good to see him here. How about Jake Fisher? He's played tight end and fullback, H-backish, yeah. And could he learn center if he's not tackle material? I think, personally speaking, I think athletically, Jake Fisher he was a tight end, I think, when Oregon recruited him, and he started there. Then they moved him to offensive line. So I think athletically he can do a lot of different things, and that was the plus side of why he was one of the top tackles or top offensive linemen in the draft in 2015. I think athletically he probably could do some things, but I think it's not a fit. I think at that point you're kind of fitting a square peg in a round hole. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I just looked up their heights. He's only an inch taller than Dealman, but several inches taller than your typical center. They have him listed on the website at 6'6". Fisher is 6'6" inches, and it's very rare to see. I know the center that came out from LSU, that Posick, whatever his name was like 6'7", and he was dinged pretty hard for that on draft day. And part of the reason is, it's possible, but like you say, and there's a lot of leverage. You're going up against, these defensive tackles who are 6'1", 6'2", and it's not that it can't be done. It's just, it's a challenging thing. It's something he's probably never done, never practiced. They could probably teach it to him. I mean, get him to try to learn it. It's a question, how successful would he be, and how many years or months would it take until he got to a point where they felt confident enough that he could step in and do that. I think it'd be more likely. You mentioned Westerman. I think someone like him or someone like Trey Hopkins, who they seem to play everywhere on the line, might be a possibility. But I think as long as Alexander's there, it's Bodine or bust. So.
Yeah, and I see two schools of thought here where if the offensive line just becomes a complete shambles this season, and you feel that Fisher, even though he may not be working out so great at right tackle, you still feel he's one of your 5 best linemen, and you want to get your 5 best linemen on the field. I understand the thinking of, well, he might, even though he's not great at right tackle, he might be better than Bodine, or we might as well see. I guess I understand that. I wouldn't understand that if the Bengals are in the middle of a playoff race, but if that's something that they think they want to tinker around with, okay. I don't think he has the build for center, and I would prefer a guy who actually has not only the build for it, but maybe some experience in playing the position, whether it's TJ Johnson, maybe Christian Westerman, maybe Trey Hopkins, as you said, who's kind of been a Swiss Army knife guy early on in mini camps and stuff. So I don't see Fisher being necessary. Go ahead.
I'd say one thing I think they could do if the offensive line does struggle a lot this year is what they've done with Fisher so far is just say, we need more than 5 offensive linemen. We're going to move him back to that jumbo, that 6th offensive lineman, and just say, hey, we've invested in guys like Eifert, A.J. Green, John Ross. We're just going to have one less receiver and figure you're going to have to take just as many defensive guys to cover them because hopefully they're that good. I mean, that's 2 top 10 picks on receivers, an elite tight end. We're throwing those guys out there. We're just going to block with 6 linemen instead of 5. And I'm just hoping, so that's a possibility. They did it some last year and the year before because they wanted to get him out there and the blocking wasn't always the best. And if it's even worse this year, it'd be interesting to see if they try something like that, a 6 offensive line package instead of the typical 5. I just hope if they do that, they don't think we're going to throw the ball to Jake Fisher and running the ball because the last thing I want is him fumbling again and turning the ball over.
One interesting kind of formation I was just thinking about, to me, if Fisher isn't able to necessarily anchor the right tackle spot, it would seem to me that he might be more of an Eric Steinbach athletic left guard type. Now, obviously, the Bengals' most tenured and quite possibly the best offensive lineman they have on their unit right now is Clint Bowling, who takes up that spot. But, it would almost sound – if you go Cedric Abwehi left tackle, Jake Fisher left guard, maybe you kick Clint Bowling in to center, which is a position he did play in, I believe, limited snaps at Georgia. Then you figure out someone else at right guard. You kick Andre Smith out to right tackle, which is a position he played for years with the Bengals and which is what he's played his entire NFL career. Instead of right guard, which he currently has the inside track of the starting job to. Maybe then you bring in a Westerman, a Trey Hopkins, someone like that to play right guard, and you really reshuffle things. I don't know. Again, that's kind of barring the line being a complete disaster, which it doesn't look great this year, but we hope it's not. This coaching staff has been hesitant to make changes at times for starting positions in the season, and if they feel that they're on the cusp of another playoff berth or a very special season, and the offensive line needs to be tinkered with, I hope that they are not hesitant to pull the trigger on some of that stuff. Scott, any additional thoughts before we get out of here?
Yeah, there was one question I wanted to answer on the YouTube chat, and I cannot remember who wrote it. There's a big list of comments and questions, so I'll just throw the question out if you remember who said it or if he wants to comment again and say who he was. But the question was whether Lewis will be back next year, and if not, who the top candidates would be to take his job. And one of the 2 answers I have, I saw someone answered already. So I'll just copy that answer because that was one of the 2 I was going to give when I saw it. Was I think if he goes, I think it's probably internal. I think they have even if they say enough with Lewis, it's time to move on. I don't know if they would do a total overhaul or just say we're moving on from Lewis, we're going to move up. I think that the candidates who would get an interview and probably the leading candidates would be internal guys, which would be either Paul Alexander or Gunther. And even though Alexander has been the assistant head coach forever, I think it'd be Gunther. He's someone I think I'd prefer it to be. Even though your friend seems to think Alexander might be a great head coach or a great coach of some sort, and I think he could be, I think those two guys would definitely be on the interview list. And of those two, I would assume Gunther. But, yeah, I just wanted to throw that out as an answer.
No, I saw that, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I agree with you in the fact that they would probably get looks, or that would be the way, because the Bengals have really done this in terms of coaching, a promotion from within type of thing. And if you work for a business or an organization for a long time, obviously you like to have opportunities for growth. I think any ambitious person does. As a Bengals fan, I would not like those hires. I think if it's Marvin Lewis's time to go, it's time to move outside. And interestingly enough, when Marvin Lewis took over, if you remember, it was after a lot of internal hires and or guys that had been around, that had experience either currently on the team or before. I mean, Bruce Coslet, Dick LeBeau, obviously David Shula was a newbie, but Lewis was taking over for guys that were kind of recycled within the organization, and obviously it's been a lot better product that he's put out on the field than his predecessors. So now you look at it, the same thing. Sam Weish was obviously another guy that was kind of recycled through the organization. Bill Walsh was a guy who was in the organization they passed on. So, I mean, it's a roll of the dice. One guy that just really keeps interesting me in terms of his demeanor, in terms of running a successful program, and this is if the Bengals want to do that weird leap into the college ranks, maybe grab the next Jim Harbaugh, Pete Carroll, that sort of thing. One guy that kind of keeps jumping out to me is Stanford's Brian Shaw. Just a guy I really respect. I think he's a guy that isn't the crazy madman that his predecessor Jim Harbaugh was, but still runs a tight ship, runs a very, very physical Stanford team, and has put out a number and has continued to carry the torch from a guy like Jim Harbaugh to make that team very competitive. And that would be a guy I would be interested in if the route is the college ranks. Obviously, there's a lot of other names out there that are, kind of recycled former NFL head coaches, and they come with their pluses and minuses. But I don't know, just a couple of names there. I'm glad you caught that question. I did see that earlier. Again, way too early to kind of speculate because Marvin Lewis is the guy for at least this year. We'll see if he can get the team on a rebound. He's done it before. They have a lot of talent. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. It's a big year, though, as we've mentioned from the get-go of this show. It's a big year for Marvin Lewis with the Cincinnati Bengals. Scott, any final thoughts before we get out of here?
I guess before we leave, I'm just going to make one I don't know what the right word is, pat myself on the back, or not that, but some sort of self-boasting comment. I finally got a chance to update my scenery here, so I now have something Bengal-related in the background. And I've actually had that for quite a while. I painted that back in September. Finally got around to getting it on the wall this past week. So
you painted that.
A couple pictures behind what you have, but finally have something up there.
Well, you painted that behind you.
Yes. Yep.
Look at you, Picasso. That's good, man. I didn't paint any of this stuff behind me.
They have one of those studios here in town where you go and you can spend some money and they have like a painting and everyone does. And it was in Ohio, it was the Ohio State logo. And so if you want to do a different one, bring your own, and you can do that. And so my wife brought our college alma mater one to paint, and I got the Bengal one to paint, thinking some point, put it on the podcast or something. And then after painting it, it just kind of sat forever. And yeah, finally just dug it up and yeah. Not exactly MC Escher or Renoir or whatever, however you pronounce him, but
well, for those of you who are listening to the audio segment, Scott has a painting. Apparently, he painted himself a very accurate one of the Bengals B. The one thing it is missing, you got to give your little John Hancock at the corner there. I'm not seeing a little Scott Schulze signature on it. You might need to do a little whiteout or something and liquid paper, a little signature there. But very good, very linear and symmetrical, and it looks good.
Thank you.
I'm proud of you, buddy. I'm proud of you. From Southern California to Ohio, here's a pat on the back for you. Good job. I like it. Mine's a little more serious, I guess. I had a colleague of my day job. She participated in something called the One Mission Buzz Off, which is for kids with cancer. And she did it in it's not so much football related, but it kind of is because it took place at Gillette Stadium in Boston. It's basically, especially for, not to sound vain or whatever, especially for a female buzzing and you're not ill and not going through chemotherapy to buzz your hair off. That's kind of a bold thing to do. So I give her credit. And it goes to charity. It creates wigs and things like that for children who have cancer and are going through chemotherapy and losing their hair. Very, very cool thing to do. So check out their website. I believe it's buzzforkids.org. Obviously a nonprofit. And she said it's something that's relatively new, but they had thousands and thousands of people at Gillette Stadium just a few weeks ago for people that were participating in this. And as a side note, she met Rob Gronkowski, Mr. Party Animal, and she was hanging out with him in one of the luxury suites. This thing wasn't necessarily tied to the Patriots, but it was they had their players there and other high profile people there, and Rob Gronkowski was one of them. So for a guy that kind of has a little bit of a reputation as a meatball, a frat boy, whatever you want to call him, a party guy. Apparently he was very visible, very active in this event. And according to my colleague, a very approachable guy, hung out with a ton of different people, was very likable, and was the guy you see on the commercials and the videos and all of that. So I know Rob Gronkowski is a bit of a polarizing type of character for some people, but it was cool to see not only my colleague and friend do this for charity, especially since I have a little boy. It's a little bit close to home, just doing something for the kids, but also on the football front, it was cool to hear that a guy that I kind of roll my eyes at a little bit, not only get involved in this organization, but also be out there and working with the volunteers and meeting with the people. And it was a pretty cool story that she told me. She showed me a lot of pictures and some with him, which was pretty interesting. So anyways, check it. If you are looking to get involved, I think they have a number of different events. Unfortunately, I was a little ignorant to this organization. Again, One Mission Buzz for Kids is their big event. So if you are into philanthropic things and doing things for kids, definitely check that out. And you can also, side note, check out this show. I've mentioned it a couple of different times on a number of different platforms. We thank you so much for all of you who have downloaded the program and who have who really send us a lot of supportive messages. Scott, one more thing before we get out of here. I said one final thought, but I had two. I got a Facebook message from somebody named Sam Anger, Anger, and he said, "Hey, Anthony, hope all is well, mate." That kind of signaled that maybe he's not from the United States initially. I heard you say on your last podcast that you're spreading across the U.S. now, which is great. Just thought I'd let you know that it's also across the pond here in the UK. Love the pod, and also keep up the good work, Houday. Greetings from Sheffield, England. And then he paid compliments to another program I was part of for a while as well. So first of all, thanks to Sam for giving us those great compliments. And Scott, we're international, baby.
That's pretty exciting. I guess we have a global reach, for good or bad.
That's right. That's right. And by the way, any listener is allowed to hit me up on Facebook if you want. Just don't stalk me or send me lewd stuff, I guess. But I mean, you're welcome to do that if you really want to. But that's not something I personally promote. But Sam found me. Awesome. We're connected. We're now friends on Facebook. So thanks, Sam. Appreciate the kind message, and hopefully you keep listening from England. Always love hearing that kind of stuff. Very flattering, and we'll try and continue to bring the good content to you and to the rest of you. Scott, good evening, sir. Fun program. Keep up the good work on Cincy Jungle, and as my far more talented co-host than I am, I appreciate everything you do, my friend.
Thanks. I'll have to see if I can bring an air painting in sometime in the next few weeks.
Yeah, you should do one of those, like, have you ever been to those the new things that are like the painting with wine or something, where people can like drink glasses of wine and paint and all that kind of stuff?
Essentially where we did this.
All right. Okay. Well, you must not have been drinking that night, because that thing is totally symmetrical, totally legit. But yeah, if you have another, hang it up. You should actually paint the teddy bear that you usually hang up. You should paint like a little version of the hooded teddy bear, and yeah, that guy. Yeah, you should you should do a painted version of that and hang it up there. That'd be awesome. Anyways, we're off the rails. We're off the rails. Thanks for tuning in live. Thanks for downloading the program. We'll see you next episode. This has been the Orange and Black Insider, the top Bengals for the fans, and we'll catch you next episode. And we'll catch Hooded Teddy Bear next episode, I think, too. See you guys later.